Hello and welcome to the CoastWA training module on coastal adaptation options analysis. My name is Trent Hunt and I'm going to step you through this module today. This is one of a series of training modules which CoastWA has put together and can be found on the CoastWA website, along with fact sheets outlining the process for each of those modules you can see up on the screen. So for an overview of today's discussion, we're going to step through what an adaptation options analysis is, when they are needed and how they are used, how you develop the options within an adaptation options analysis, when and how you involve the community in the process, what options should be considered and how they are assessed, how and when they are implemented, and then we'll step through some examples and lessons learnt. There's a number of relevant references and documents which will be or components will be referred to today, and a useful reading and background. So there's the West Australian Coastal Zone Strategy, the State Planning Policy 2.6 State Coastal Planning Policy, and SPP 2.6 State Coastal Planning Policy Guidelines. There's the Coastal Hazard Risk Management and Adaptation Planning Guidelines, or the CHARMAP Guidelines, Local Coastal Hazard Assessment template, and the Sea Level Change in Western Australia document and the application to coastal planning. So if you're not familiar with any of these documents, I'd recommend at least having a flick through and familiarising yourself as I set out most of the framework for what we're going to be discussing today. So what's coastal adaptation? A coastal adaptation is an adjustment in the natural or human systems in response to actual or expected stimuli or their effects, which moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities. Adaptation is the means for maximising the gains and minimising the losses associated with coastal hazards over the planning timeframe. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but in the context of WA coastal planning, it's the response to the impacts of coastal hazards. And what are coastal hazards? Well, coastal hazards are defined under SPP 2.6 as the consequence of coastal processes that affect the environment and safety of people. They're a source of potential harm and largely include coastal erosion, so the loss of land due to coastal processes, or inundation, which is the coastal flooding due to elevated water levels. These are assessed through coastal hazard assessments, and these have been presented in earlier modules. So if you need any background to those coastal processes, coastal hazards, and coastal hazard assessments, I'd refer you back to those previous modules which were presented. So what's an adaptation options analysis? Adaptation options analysis is the process of identifying and analysing various strategies or actions to mitigate the impacts of coastal hazards. So they aim to develop and ultimately implement an adaptation plan, strategy or action. So they can be quite broad. They can be a broad strategy of action, or they can be quite detailed, so a specific action. And the example pathway, which is shown on the bottom of the screen there, shows a response or adaptation to, in this case, sea level rise and increasing sea level rise over time, and the various options and how those options, appropriate options, may change and the pathway through those over time as those hazards increase. So adaptation options analysis process has a number of steps. And it's really important that these steps are kind of worked through. So firstly, you kind of frame up or identify the problem which we're attempting to respond to. So we'd identify the objectives of the adaptation, we'd identify the values to be retained or achieved. We'd then start with identifying a range of options, and we'd start wide, so we start with identifying the full range of options, and we consider the hierarchy of options and which ones are more appropriate than others. We'd then look to filter and refine these options, so identify any fatal flaws, step through which of these options are really not appropriate, and then develop a bit of a smaller shortlist. We'd refine those options and then complete some analysis of them, so whether that's through multi-criteria analysis, or it could include cost-benefit analysis. We'd attempt to compare the options. We'd then confirm any impacts and trade-offs associated with those preferred options, get acceptance from stakeholders, and then step through recommendations and implementation planning. In each of these stages, we'd look to get stakeholder engagement and buy into the process and input through that entire process. So we're going to step through this in a little bit more detail throughout this presentation and module. The adaptation options analysis is ultimately used to develop a preferred option. And again, that option can be a pathway, it can be a broad strategy, or a specific action. It's often used then to develop an implementation plan, setting out that pathway or strategy or action. It can be completed as part of the coastal hazard risk management adaptation planning process, or it could be a more detailed assessment following that first broad process. We'll just give a recap now and a bit of a step through of those char map stages to familiarise ourselves with those. So the Coastal Hazard Risk Management Adaptation Planning Framework, which is set up and outlined under SPP 2.6 in the char map guidelines, has a series of 6 stages, and the coastal adaptation options analysis fall under stage 5, the risk treatment. We'll just step through and familiarise ourselves with each of those stages now. So stage 1 is around establishing the context. So we want to determine the purpose of what we're trying to achieve, the objectives, the scope, the study area and extent that we're looking to complete these adaptation works over, the values which we're attempting to retain or create, the existing controls which are present at our site, and then the success criteria we're measuring the adaptation against. In stage 2 of the char map process, we identify the risks. So this is where we complete the coastal hazard assessments and identify those relevant coastal hazards. We identify the assets and those assets which may be at risk of coastal hazards in the timeframes, and we complete hazard mapping. Stage 3 is then the completion of the vulnerability assessment. So we're using the coastal hazards, we're assessing the vulnerability of our assets to those coastal hazards. Stage 4, the risk evaluation stage. This stage aims to prioritise the risk management measures. So we'd assess the risk, we then consider the impact of any existing controls, re-evaluate our risks, and then can prepare updated risk assessments. And often this is just around identifying those areas or assets which are priorities to complete adaptation works over. Once we've created or determined our priorities for risk treatment, and in doing so, the risk and vulnerability tolerance scales should be used. So this identifies the risks that require the treatment. Once we've identified treatments required, then the level of vulnerability of those assets should inform the priorities. And the risk treatment options include consideration of both erosion and inundation, and different areas may have different vulnerabilities and require different treatments to both erosion and inundation. The stage 5 of the char map process is then the risk treatment. So this considers how to respond to the risks and asset vulnerability. It assesses the risk treatment options, and these risk treatment options are referred to as coastal adaptation options, and identifies risk management pathways and the triggers which would trigger action along those pathways. So when's an adaptation options analysis needed and how are they used? Adaptation options are required when the risk evaluation has determined those risks are intolerable. And this may come back to risk rating scales for local governments, often have their own risk management criteria and requirements, but it has determined that a risk treatment is required, and this risk treatment is often the adaptation option. This can be completed as part of the char map process, or as we identified, it can be completed following the initial char map process. When it's completed following the char map process, it's often a more detailed assessment, so it may take a short list of options, for instance, which have come out of the char map process, and refine those options or consider additional data and investigate them in a lot more detail. The adaptation options analysis is then used to develop appropriate adaptation options. So it would develop a range of options or develop, refine and further develop options which would meet the objectives and values which have been agreed upon, which would reduce the risks of impact from coastal hazards, and would enhance the benefits to the community. It's used to compare between the potential options. There may be a wide or narrow range of options which may be appropriate. The adaptation options analysis then compares those various options and is then used to determine an appropriate implementation pathway and relevant triggers. We're now going to discuss how these adaptation options are developed. The adaptation options are often developed with specific site objectives and constraints in mind, and these will vary depending on what assets you are attempting to mitigate risks from, what coastal values are critical at your site, and what the site conditions are like. So it really requires a key understanding of the coastal values of the community and stakeholders, which are largely completed in earlier stages of the CHARMAP process. It's really important also to bear in mind that values can change and objectives can change and risks can change. So there may be a lag in time between completing the first stage of the CHARMAP and a detailed options analysis, and some of these things can change over time. There may also be a change in opinion, change in groups, change in stakeholders, and all these things can have an impact on the preferred adaptation option. So it's really important to work with the stakeholders through the process and identify any of these changes to determine the most appropriate adaptation option. In developing adaptation options, it's important to initially consider and assess a full range of risk treatments available to us. So we want to start really wide and consider all the possible options which there are. And then as we step our way through the process, we want to narrow those down to end up with a smaller range or short list of options which meet all our requirements. So we want to consider our options across a range of criteria, and we consider them on a hierarchy. Some options are preferable to others. The adaptation hierarchy, which is presented in the bottom right there, which we'll step into in a little bit more detail soon. This is taken from the CHARMAP guidelines and provides us that hierarchy of options to consider. And we may want to initially consider the strategies, the broader strategy, how that fits in the context of these options, and then fine-tune that down to a specific option. Throughout this whole process, we want to make sure we're getting appropriate community and stakeholder involvement. So this may be determined through a community and stakeholder engagement strategy to ensure we get input from the community through the whole process. And you may want to consider doing this through a community engagement panel or reference group, where you may have members from community groups, key stakeholders, or just open that up to expressions of interest from the community, for instance. This allows collaborative input to the assessment. It allows education of those key stakeholders and providing them with the relevant information to feed into this process. And they can really be representatives back to the community to drive the process as well. So that risk management and adaptation hierarchy, which we discussed, is set up on the basis to consider the retention of decision-making flexibility through the process. So options which retain flexibility are preferred and higher in the hierarchy. So there are 4 broad categories which are identified. Firstly, avoid any coastal hazards, planned or managed retreat, accommodate, and then protect. And the adaptation options are assessed down the hierarchy, so we'd always attempt to avoid where possible. So the first of our categories is the avoid category or option, and this avoids construction of new assets within any coastal hazard areas. So in doing so, we're avoiding the impact of coastal erosion or inundation. And this is the preferred risk treatment option where it's possible, as it retains that flexibility. We can always do something else later. It largely applies to greenfield locations or undeveloped locations where you do not have assets or development within the coastal hazard areas. So the second category on the hierarchy is retreat, and this is largely planned or managed retreat, which aims to preserve the coastal assets and public access, along with recreation, conservation and forestry management values, by largely relocating or moving assets or infrastructure when those coastal hazard impacts or risks are too high or when trigger points are reached. So planned or managed retreat moves them prior to being lost. They also may move them those assets at the end of their service life. So, for example, we may have a beach access stairs, let's say, which is at risk of coastal erosion. We plan to move that back and retreat the asset before it's lost so that it can continue to perform its function in providing beach access. The third category is accommodate. So accommodate uses design or management strategies which render the risks as tolerable or acceptable, allowing land or foreshores to continue to be used until the risks become intolerable. This may include a mix of structural and non-structural approaches and can often switch to retreat options later. So this may include things such as your typical Queenslander houses, which may be built on stilts, they're built high to accommodate floodwaters underneath. These type of options and can also, as we've noted, we can switch to retreat options later if those risks really do become intolerable. And the final category is protect. So protect is the classic protecting assets from impacts of erosion and inundation, say via a seawall or a hard structure. This should only be incorporated when it is in the public interest and it's congruent with coastal processes and assets. And the protect option is the last or least preferred category on the hierarchy. The CharMap guidelines also discuss a no regrets options, and no regrets options aim to retain flexibility and improve resilience in the system. So these are options which address long-term impacts and short-term conditions and may be implemented, for instance, in the time while a preferred risk treatment option is being determined. And prior to implementing the long-term implementation or adaptation works. The CharMap guidelines also discuss do nothing. So the do nothing case is essentially accepting the losses. This assumes that the current risk levels are tolerable. It's often used as a basis for comparison. So what are our cost benefits, for instance, between doing nothing and completing works? And this may result in reactive action to hazards as they occur. So for instance, we do nothing, we start to lose a section of beach access path and we remove it as it occurs rather than planning for it preemptively. This requires really careful stakeholder information and engagement to let them know that this is the approach which is being taken rather than getting those really reactive responses to, for instance, erosion impacting assets. So we'll step through the individual adaptation options within those broader categories now. The hierarchy presented the broader categories of options. So we had the avoid, the retreat, the accommodate, and the protect. As noted earlier, we want to start really wide and consider all of the potential options for our site, work our way down through that hierarchy and determine which of the various options may be appropriate for our specific conditions. And indicative treatments for each of the categories are presented. So the avoid option is a singular option. We're avoiding development or construction of new assets within the coastal hazard zones. The little table or the extract from the table which is shown on this slide is from the CharMap guidelines. It outlines the broad category, the options under that category, and then some comments around it. So I won't step through all of these in detail, but I'd refer you to the CharMap guidelines to provide some more information. The retreat options include planned and managed retreat, where we leave our assets unprotected, and again we accept those losses due to the coastal hazards and attempt to move our assets away from the coast or the coastal hazard. Retreat also includes the demolition and removal or relocation of assets from inside the hazard areas and then prevention of further development within those hazard areas. And finally, voluntary acquisition, so voluntary purchase of land of private property. The accommodate options largely include designing assets, so designing those assets which are going to be within coastal hazard areas to withstand the impacts of those coastal hazards. Or also beach nourishment and replenishment is considered an accommodate option. The protect options then are your more hard structural solutions. So we have construction of groins, construction of seawalls, artificial reefs or submerged reefs, offshore breakwaters or headlands. Then we have the no regrets options. So these are things that can be completed prior to or along with any of these other options. So things such as coastal monitoring, so the collection of monitoring data, coastal protection structure audits, so condition assessments, for instance, of coastal protection structures. We have the notification on titles of private properties, for instance, these assets or properties may be at risk of coastal hazards, along with emergency evacuation plans. And then we have the do nothing option. So again, the do nothing is essentially taking no action and accepting the losses which may occur. So how do we analyse these various options and compare between them? Well, stepping back to the adaptation options analysis process, which we presented earlier, we framed the problem or the risks at our site, identified the values and objectives. We've now identified a full range of options and we've started to filter and refine between those options. So what we want to do now is further develop a shortlist of options and refine those options, and then complete the analysis and comparison through items such as a multi-criteria analysis or cost-benefit analysis. So in that analysis of options, we initially filter our wide range of options, considering things like fatal flaws. And this looks at the objectives of our assets, the function of our assets, our coastal values and objectives, and ensures that they're complementary. So for instance, a surf lifesaving club, which is required to be located on the coastline, can't avoid all risks as it's required to be adjacent to the coast. A port is required to be located on the coastline. An LGA or main roads, for instance, may require a distributor road to remain in its current location, for instance, or a community may value retention of its sandy beach and loss of that beach may not be acceptable. So these consideration of any of these really critical objectives or values can filter out some of the options and just make sure, determine them to be unviable. So a fatal flaw or a first pass filtering is completed against our project objectives, our values or our success criteria. And from those, we filter out down to a short list of potential appropriate treatments. These potential options would then be assessed via a multi-criteria analysis or a cost-benefit analysis, for instance. So once we have our short list of potentially appropriate treatments, we would probably develop these smaller range of options in a bit more detail and refine them, develop concepts for what they might look like, consider their impacts, their pros, cons, and their costs, and then complete a multi-criteria analysis or a cost-benefit analysis against them. So a multi-criteria analysis, or an MCA, is really just a framework for assessing and comparing appropriate options. It requires a consideration of different success criteria, so multi-criteria. Often it considers technical, environmental, social, and economic criteria. So you select the criteria, we select some weighting and a scoring system, and how these are selected and attributed has a big impact on the outcome of the assessment. So they've got to be selected really carefully and ideally with input from stakeholder groups. These criteria should be linked to the values and objectives which were determined earlier in the process, and as I said, tested with the stakeholders. So as an example, the starting point might be 4 criteria: technical, social, environmental and economic, with a 25% weighting against each to make them as important as each other. Typically, these criteria might look like something like these. So the technical criteria would consider the technical effectiveness of the strategy or option, the adaptability of the option, and the complexity of any approval requirements. The social criteria may consider the provision of beach and recreational opportunities. It might consider coastal amenity or aesthetics, the accessible coastline, and provision of recreational facilities. The environmental criteria may consider the preservation of the beach, the dune environment, and the marine environment. Economic criteria may consider the capital or construction costs along with the maintenance or operational costs of each of the options, and it often score them on a 1 to 5 system for each of the criteria. So some example technical criteria, and often the technical criteria would be broken into sub-criteria to consider each of the appropriate items. In this example, we've assessed effectiveness, adaptability, and the legal approval requirements. And again, each of those sub-criteria can have different weighting to them depending on how important an element is. So as an example, under the technical criteria, we want the thing to work. Whatever our option is that we're considering, we want it to be effective. So typically your effectiveness would be ranked quite high within this. And we just rank them on that 1 to 5 system. So typically a 1 score would be not, in this case, effective, and 5 would be completely effective. And we'd rank them all on a subjective basis between those. Examples of social criteria may be that they provide a beach and active recreational opportunities, that they provide amenity and aesthetics, that they ensure the coastlines accessible for all, and that they provide recreational facilities. Again, you can weight these sub-criteria and then they'd be scored on a 1 to 5 system. Example of environmental criteria may be preservation of the beach and dune environment and preservation of the marine environment, again ranked on a 1 to 5. And economic criteria are typically capital cost and ongoing and maintenance costs. And it is really important that you do consider both the upfront cost and the ongoing cost. Some options are heavy on the construction cost with lower maintenance or operational costs once installed. Other options, which may be cheaper to implement upfront, may have substantial ongoing or maintenance costs through the life of the project. So making sure we're considering those over the life of the project is really important. As an example, what you would then do is put all of those scores, your 1 to 5 scores, into a matrix such as this, apply the weighting and work out the scores, and then rank between these options. So in this particular example where we're looking at a protect option, you can see that the sand nourishment example came out far higher. This may guide you to a single preferred to take further, or it might guide you to several potential options which you want to explore in a bit more detail. The sensitivity to each of those criteria and rankings should be considered as well. So you may want to test sensitivity to different weightings. Different criteria will have different rankings. So depending on how you rank or how you weight those options, the score may come out differently, and you should test both the sensitivity of the overall larger criteria and the sub-criteria. So what we do in this particular case is you play with those weightings. So rather than being a 25 even split across each of those criteria, you may heavily weight, for instance, the social criteria and drop the cost, or heavily weight the cost and drop the environment. However you may want to do those and test each of those scenarios. And the plot on the right-hand side here shows the grey is showing the banding of all the different potential options. And in this particular case, you can see that no matter what the different weightings are, there was one option which was far preferred under each of those weighting systems. And so that's just good guidance that that's the appropriate option to take further. So a multi-criteria analysis output, this would further refine our list. So whether we're getting it down to a single preferred, or whether we're identifying several suitable options for a detailed assessment or to take to the next stage. Those preferred option or options can then be assessed in a cost-benefit analysis. A cost-benefit analysis, or a CBA process, assists in refining the appropriate range of options and prioritising the options. So it is, as the name suggests, it identifies both the costs and the benefits associated with each of those options. It includes the economic, so the capital and maintenance costs, along with the social and environment costs or benefits. So for instance, loss of a usable recreational beach would be a social cost, and provision of a recreational beach would be a social benefit, and attempts to score each of these. Those costs may be direct or indirect, and they're considered over the planning timeframe or the life of the project or options. So under the costs, in the cost benefit analysis, whole of life costs need to be considered. So this would consider things such as the capital construction costs initially, along with maintenance of those options, operational costs, any demolition or removal costs at the end of the project, and it requires an accurate estimate of costs. So you need to have some appropriate concepts and some really appropriate costing information done up, or it will really affect the outcome of your analysis. We'd also consider the loss of environmental or social values within those costs. So a loss of a vegetated dune, for instance, would have an environmental cost associated with it. The benefits then represent a reduction in impact from the implementation of an option. So providing a beach or reducing how much beach is lost will provide a benefit. And this includes avoided costs. It also includes gains in environmental or social value. So using the dune example again, if we can increase the amount of vegetated dune providing biodiversity and habitat, that is an environmental benefit and would be considered in the cost benefit analysis. So the CBA, to complete the CBA, an accurate assessment of asset value is also important. So the CBA would use an appropriate discount rate. It considers sensitivity of those discount rates and other things to account for the variability in the assumptions. And it determines a number of things, including a net present economic value, or NPEV, which is the sum of the discounted benefits less the sum of the discounted costs. It would also consider a benefit cost ratio, which is a ratio of the present value of benefits to the present value of costs. And typically an option would be viable if the net present economic value is positive and the benefit cost ratio is greater than 1. So as an example, the table here shows an example of a CBA. We've got various discount rates tested there to test the sensitivity to these. And we've summed our costs and our benefits. We've got them in the table there for this particular option, and calculated the net present economic value and the benefit cost ratio. So in this particular example, the benefit cost ratio for each of the discount rates is greater than 1. So that's showing there's higher benefit than cost, and the net present economic value is positive. Therefore, the option appears to be viable. So often associated with the CBA or following that process, a benefit distribution analysis can then be completed. So BDA applies the user or beneficiary pays system to assist in apportioning costs for the adaptation works. So it's attempting to say that those that benefit from the adaptation works should predominantly pay for those works. It's often completed only on the preferred option, although sometimes considers a range of options, and also considers a base case, which is often a status quo type case or a business as usual type case. The BDA has been covered in Module 3 of this series with the link provided below, so I'd refer you to that for some further information. Once we've completed our analysis of options, we may want to reconsider our impacts and trade-offs of the various options. So particularly for developed sites where we have a built-up site, there's unlikely to be a single adaptation options which meets all of the project objectives and all stakeholder desires. The stakeholder desires between user groups can vary widely, and trade-offs may therefore be required. So the trade-offs may include things such as removal or relocation of assets when they're threatened, or an ongoing placement of sand to provide a sandy beach at all times. Following the analysis of options, these impacts should be reconsidered in detail for preferred options. We're now going to discuss how and when our adaptation options are implemented. The implementation of adaptation options is often linked to risk management pathways. These risk management pathways enable the establishment of the decision-making strategy. It's made up a sequence of decision-making points over time. So you reach a trigger or a decision-making point. At that point, choose to stay on or choose a new pathway. And this risk management pathway approach combines decision-making at these trigger points for risk treatments within an ongoing process that maintains flexibility in treatments over time. So under an adaptation or risk management pathway, each decision-making point along the pathway is triggered by a change. That change may be a change in information, it may be a change in values, it may be a change in erosion or coastal processes. Each decision-making point has associated risk treatment options associated with it, and the selection of an adaptation option leads to the next risk management pathway and the next decision-making point. At each of these decision-making points, the wide range of options is retained. So shown on the figure here is an example of a risk management pathway. Over on the left-hand side are a range of adaptation options which have been determined to be appropriate for this particular location and issue. On the bottom axis here is time, passage of time, and associated with that time the expected increases in sea level rise. And then what we've got here are our range of adaptation options and pathways which are appropriate. So each of these little circles are trigger points or decision-making points. And what we can see is that as we're moving through time, sea level rise is increasing, we reach a trigger point or a decision-making point, at which time we can choose to stay on that pathway or move to a new pathway. And often those pathways are associated with increasing kind of level of intervention. So we may move from developing planning policies to design of implementation options into, once we move down into our risks becoming severe down this end, we've got implementing those adaptation works, which in this case may be in the form of sand nourishment. So along that decision making, along that risk management pathway, there's a series of triggers, and the identification of triggers allow planning for when implementation is required. So those triggers can be time-based or they can be event-based. For instance, it may be when coastal erosion reaches a certain point or when there is only such and such remaining buffer left. For LGAs, these triggers can be linked to risk management frameworks, and often the event type triggers may be linked to coastal monitoring. So we may be able to monitor our coast to assess remaining buffers, for instance, at sites. Within the CharMap guidelines, there are a series of triggers. The table presented on this page shows a range of triggers which are appropriate. So, for instance, the HSD is within the S1 distance of an asset, so within the distance which may be lost in one significant severe storm, or other ones such as assets are predicted to become vulnerable within the next planning timeframe. So there's a series of different triggers which can be incorporated into that planning pathway framework. Now I'm going to step through a series of examples and case studies to reiterate how we go about completing adaptation options assessments. The first one I'm going to talk about is a greenfield example of an undeveloped site. And this is a completely fictitious site. But in this particular case, we've got an undeveloped section of coastline. We're looking to develop, in this case, a foreshore development some distance back from the coast. The lines shown on the page, on the map, are hazard lines. In this particular case, a 50-year and a 100-year line. You can see that our development is located entirely behind that 100-year line. So in this particular case, the options assessment is less formal. It's very clear the appropriate pathway based on that hierarchy we talked about earlier, as we're able to avoid all risk of coastal hazards in this particular case, and the avoid option becomes the most appropriate. As a second example, we'll speak about one in a much more developed location at Port Beach in Fremantle. Port Beach was an area which is identified as a hotspot of high management importance. It had had a history in recent years of significant coastal erosion, causing loss of assets in the area and threatening significant assets. There was a CharMat completed for the area, including Port Beach. It identified the high value of a number of these assets to local stakeholders. And there were a large number of stakeholders, including the City of Fremantle, Fremantle Ports, which is on the southern side, Main Roads, WA, business owners, recreational owners, and the local community. So referring back to the adaptation options analysis process we presented earlier, having been through a CharMat process already for the site, some of this work was already done. So the problem essentially was framed, the objectives and community values were framed, a range of options had been determined and they'd been filtered and assessed to some detail. What was then done in this particular case is this step here onwards. So the options were filtered and refined. The shortlisted option were developed further, stepped through a multi-criteria analysis and cost-benefit analysis, assessed impacts and trade-offs, and went into recommendations for implementation. Due to the large number of stakeholders at Port Beach, a stakeholder reference group was formed. This included representatives from the city, along with local user groups, Fremantle Ports, Main Roads and PTA, and feedback and input was sought at each stage of the assessment and on the various options and their assessment right the way through this process. So initial range of options was refined and developed, concepts were developed for each of these options. This consisted of sketches and renders, estimated costs, the pros, cons and impacts of each of those options. The example presented on the right there is one of the options which was not successful eventually, but it's an example of the type of rendering and imagery which is developed for each of those options. So once the options had been developed in terms of concepts, costs, pros, cons, etc., a multi-criteria analysis and a cost-benefit analysis was completed on each of them. The criteria for that MCA were based on the values and the project objectives determined earlier, and this assessment was tested with the reference group and modified or refined several times through. Here's an example of the output of that MCA, which led to a preferred option. That preferred option was large-scale sand nourishment. The trade-offs were determined associated with this option and communicated to the stakeholder groups. And in this particular case, some of the trade-offs included the fact that that large-scale sand nourishment would move. It would require maintenance in terms of running sand back from further up the beach and replacing it over time. These impacts were reviewed and determined to be appropriate. A detailed design process was undertaken and the works were ultimately implemented. This is an example of the dredge showing the rainbowing of sand on shore, which was completed to complete those sand nourishment works. The last example I'm going to step through is from South Thompson Bay on Rottnest Island. So again, South Thompson was identified as a coastal hotspot. It had a history in recent years of ongoing erosion with really limited buffer to holiday chalets, which were of high value to Rottnest Island Authority, but also users of the island. It was a really high value site and this was seen as a critical issue. A char map had been developed for the site and a coastal erosion management plan developed. The coastal erosion management plan developed adaptation strategies and assessed them and provided an implementation plan on when triggers were reached. The adaptation pathway was developed along with these management triggers, which were to be assessed through monitoring of the beach widths and the buffers remaining. And in recent years, that coastal erosion at the site had increased, which meant that the monitoring indicated these triggers were hit far earlier than they were expected to be. The stakeholders, including the Rottnest Island Authority, reviewed these risks and implemented a protect pathway. That protect pathway assessed various options and determined a seawall was the preferred. That seawall was designed and implemented several years ago and is protecting those holiday chalets. We'll just discuss several lessons learned through the adaptation options analysis processes. Through completing a number of adaptation options assessments, we've learned a number of lessons which are worth sharing. It's really important that the objectives of the particular site or piece of work are well defined and understood. So the project objectives can have a huge impact on the preferred option. You need to initially ensure that the range of potential options are wide enough that we're considering everything which is suitable. We ensure that community input is gained early and then again throughout that process as the objectives, the values and the risks can change through the process. It's important to ensure that the values are well understood. So what is actually meant by some of those values? does a retention of a beach mean at all costs, or does retention of a beach at sometimes kind of meet what the community is looking for instance? We need to ensure that the constraints of the sites are well understood, and this comes back into the assessment of technical criteria. We need to ensure the narrative of the recommended option is understood and communicated clearly to stakeholders. Ensure the risks are treated by the option so that they are actually effective, and then ensure that the trade-offs and impacts are well understood.